The summer she turned 20, Hannah Reese stood at the edge of the only pond on her family's dying farm in Kiowa County, Colorado, and pulled the plug on her own water. The green water crept away all afternoon, low and slow, and behind it rose a thing nobody expected. A wide floor of black muck cracking at the edges under a dust-colored sky. She held her grandfather's worn notebook against her chest and said nothing. Down at the fence line, the neighbors watched with their arms crossed, and one of them laughed out loud. She drained her water. In a drought. On the last piece of land the bank had not taken yet. Everyone in that county was sure she had lost her mind. And for a long while, it looked like they were right. What they could not see was what 20 years had folded into that mud, or why an old man's handwriting told her to dig it up while everyone else prayed for rain. This is a story with a hard turn in it, and another after that. And the strangest part waits at the very end, when the same men who laughed came walking up to her fence with their hats in their hands. But to understand what she found down there, you have to go back to the beginning. Here is what settles to the bottom of a stock pond and why it matters. Picture a kitchen sink you never fully drain. Every rain that crosses a pasture carries loose soil, dead grass, leaves, the fine, dark crumbs of anything that once lived. All of it drifts to the low spot and sinks. Water moves on, it evaporates, it seeps away, but the heavy black grit stays behind and settles, year after year, pressed down under its own weight. Over 20 years, a pond floor turns into a layer of muck that farmers on the high plains have quietly prized for 100 years. That muck is mostly organic matter, the same thing a compost pile is made of, only wetter and older and darker. It holds nutrients the way a wrung-out rag holds one last squeeze of water. Nitrogen, phosphorus, the slow minerals that worn-out fields have long since given up. Spread thin over dead ground, it feeds soil that has forgotten how to grow. And it does a thing no sack of fertilizer can match. Organic matter works like a sponge in the dirt itself. A field rich in it can hold several times its own weight in water. So a single rain lingers for weeks instead of running off in an afternoon. On the high plains, where wind lifts bare topsoil and hauls it away as brown clouds, the way the Dust Bowl once carried whole farms up into the sky, that buried sponge is the difference between ground that stays put and ground that leaves. There is one hard catch, and the old hands know it cold. Fresh pond muck comes up wet and often salty, and salt burns young roots as sure as any fire. It has to be dried, aired, and weathered a full season before it will feed a single seed. Rush it, and it kills whatever you plant. So the black floor rose out of the drained water, wide and steaming a little in the heat, cracking into plates the size of dinner tables, salt whitening along every seam like frost creeping across a January window. Robert Reese died in the spring of 2019, on the same 40 acres his own father had broken with a mule and a walking plow. Hannah found the notebook in his coat, where he had kept it after the funeral of his father before him. 51 years of handwriting lived in it, columns of dates and rainfall, little sketches of soil layers, a rule underlined twice at the top of the first page. Feed the ground, and the ground will feed you back. She read it at the kitchen table by the light of one bulb, and outside the wind carried away another thin skin of her fields. By late that year the land was tired past pretending. The wheat came up patchy and short. Where a boot pressed down, the topsoil puffed and drifted like flour off a board. The county called it a bad stretch. Hannah, counting the columns, saw the truth in her grandfather's own hand. The organic matter had fallen from a healthy figure to almost nothing, decade by decade, until the dirt could not hold a rain or a root. She was still doing that arithmetic when a pickup rolled up the lane. Dale Whitcomb from the bank, boots polished, folder under his arm. He did not get out. "Your daddy was 3 payments behind when he passed," he said through the window. "I'd hate to see this place go at auction, Hannah. Honest advice? Sell the equipment, take a job in Lamar." She held the notebook against the doorframe and said nothing. He tapped the folder twice and drove off, and the dust of his leaving hung a long time in the still air. That night she did not sleep. She turned every page by lamplight, tracing the small square her grandfather had inked at the low corner of the home quarter, the stock pond, marked over and over with one word she had never understood. Water bank, he had written beside it, and under that, 3 times across 3 different years, the same short line. She set her finger on it, reached for a pencil, and began to copy the words onto the back of her own hand. By the last week of July, she had hired a neighbor's old drag line for $40 an hour and started pulling the pond floor up in dripping black slabs. The muck came out heavy and sweet rotten, sliding off the bucket in ropes, and she spread it thin across the worst blown-out corner of the home quarter, the way the notebook told her, 1 wet load at a time. The sun laid a white salt crust over every pile within a day. Hannah walked the rows with the little book open in one hand, marking where each load fell, and said nothing to the trucks that slowed on the county road to watch. They did not stay quiet for long. Merle Tolliver, who farmed the big half-section to the north and stood ahead over any man in the co-op, leaned out his window and hollered that she was hauling sewage onto good dirt. "Your granddad's gone soft in your head, Hannah," he called, and laughed so the whole cab shook. At the elevator in Eads, it got worse. Gary Pruitt, the co-op man who weighed everybody's grain, told it like a joke over the counter to anyone buying seed. A Reese girl drained her only pond in the driest year in memory, he said, then went and smeared the bottom of it across her fields like a child playing in a hog wallow. Men laughed into their coffee. One of them started calling her the Mud Farmer, and the name stuck to her all down Main Street. She let them talk. She weighed nothing. She argued nothing. She wrote. In the back of the notebook, her grandfather had left a column of his own, dated across 3 dry decades, and beside the drained basin, he had penciled a figure she kept coming back to. Good pond bottom, he had written, ran near 10 times richer in organic matter than the tired ground above it. Sprinkle salt on a cut slice of eggplant and watch what happens. Within minutes, beads of water rise to the skin and the flesh goes limp. The salt never soaked in from outside. It pulled the water out from within because water always drifts toward wherever salt is thickest, trying to even the balance. A young root sitting in salty ground meets that same quiet pull. The seedling strains to drink the moisture around it, and the salt in the soil tugs the water the other way, back out through the root walls. When the salt wins, the plant thirsts while standing in wet dirt, and its leaves curl and scorch brown, as though a flame had run across them. Growers call it burning, though nothing ever catches fire. It is why fresh pond bottom, for all its dark richness, can kill the very first thing planted in it before a single true leaf opens. There is a second thing soaked ground does that surprises everyone the first time. Heap up dry sand, and it holds a steady slope, grain resting on grain, patient as a dune. Pour water through that same heap, and it sags and runs, because the water slips into every tiny gap between the grains and floats them apart, so they slide instead of grip. A pond floor just dug open is saturated clear through to its core. Cut the sides too steep, and the wet wall loses hold of itself,
and one still night it slumps down into the hollow, dragging the day's careful grading with it. The only fix is time.
Let the water bleed out. Let air work down into the crumbs, and the ground slowly learns to stand on its own weight again. So the black bottom that came up out of a drained pond was two things at once. It was 10 times richer than the blown-out dirt around it, and it was too raw and too wet to feed one seed or hold one bank. Salt had to leach. Walls had to settle. Air and sun had to do their slow work through a whole turn of the seasons. How long can a farm with 3 missed payments and a folder in the banker's hand afford to stand there and wait for mud to become soil? The man who finally stopped at her gate drove a truck older than she was, primer gray, one door a different color from the rest. Emmett Slade had spent 31 years with the Soil Conservation District out of Eads before his knees quit on him, and he had heard, like everyone else on that road, that a Reese girl was smearing pond bottom across blown-out dirt. He came to look and to shake his head. He crouched at the edge of a pile, rolled a crusted clod between 2 fingers, touched it to his tongue, and spat. "Salty as a cured ham," he said. "You planted straight into this, didn't you?" Hannah opened the notebook to the burned rows, where she had penciled the date the seedlings curled and went brown. He read it the way an old hand reads a weather sky. "Sodium's got your clay locked up tight. Won't pass a drop of water," he told her. "So you leach it. Let winter and every rain carry the salt down and away. Then you break the sodium's hold with gypsum. The calcium trades places with it, and the ground finally opens and breathes." He walked the slumped basin wall, kicked its wet foot, watched a wedge of it slide. "Cut this back to a lazy slope. Let it dry in lifts, a little at a time. Ground has to earn its own footing before it'll stand." She had no cash to pay him. She offered the only thing she owned free and clear, her grandfather's hand-forged fence tools and a season of her own hands through his calving. Slade looked at the black piles going ashen gray at the edges as they dried, and put out a rough palm. "Spread it thin. Work it into the old dirt. Half of one, half of the other. Give it a full turn of the year, then you plant." They cured the muck all that fall, turning it, letting the salt bleed off in the slow rains. By the following spring, she drilled one short test strip, 40 feet, into the amended corner, seed going into ground that crumbled dark and cool against her fingers. For 11 days, the row lay bare. On the 12th, she came out at first gray light, and there, along the black soil, needle-fine and standing, ran a single green line of new wheat lifting itself out of the dirt her county had told her to sell. The wind came out of the southwest in the 3rd week of March and did not lie down for 9 days. Hannah stood on the porch step and watched the horizon turn the color of a bruise, brown climbing into brown, the sun a dull coin behind it. By noon, the light in the kitchen was the light of dusk. Grit sifted under the door and gathered in a fine line along the sill, and she taped wet dish rags around the window frames, the way the notebook said her grandfather's own mother had done back in the 30s. Out on the tired ground the county farmed, the topsoil lifted and left. Merle Tolliver's summer fallow, worked bare and clean the way the elevator men praised, rose off the field in sheets and rolled east across the road in long tan waves. Fences filled to the second wire with drift. Past Eads, a stretch of highway closed for 2 days because a man could not see the hood of his own truck. Hannah walked her amended corner in the worst of it, a bandana knotted over her mouth, and knelt where the black rose stood. The soil her county had called sewage held its crumbs and held its water, cool a hand's width down while the neighbor's dirt flew. 2 seasons of cured pond bottom, worked half and half into the blown-out ground,
and it lay there, heavy and dark and staying. She wrote the date and the wind speed, and one word: holding. Then the letter came, and it did not come from the bank. It came from the state, a certified envelope she signed for at the box on the county road. A complaint had been filed. Someone had reported that a Reese had drained a body of water without a permit, that the old stock pond might fall under protected waters, and that an officer would drive out to inspect the site and assess what the notice called unauthorized alteration. The penalty listed ran to $8,000, more cash than the farm had seen whole in 3 years. She read it twice in the blowing grit.
Then she folded it into the back of the notebook, right against the word holding, lifted the truck keys off the nail by the door, and started down the road toward Eads to find out whose name was behind the call. Delia Marsh from the State Water Office drove out on a Tuesday in April with a violation half-written and a clipboard on the seat beside her. She had the complaint in her folder, sworn and signed. A Reese girl had drained protected waters without a permit. Hannah walked her the length of the emptied basin, past the lined catchment where the small seep still fed a foot of clean water, and stood while the officer knelt on the old pond floor and pressed her hand flat to the dark ground. Marsh asked how the pond had been made. Hannah opened the notebook to a page from 1961 where her grandfather had sketched the basin his own hands scraped out with a borrowed team, fed by rain off 40 acres and 1 weak seep, joined to no creek and no river in the county. A stock pond a family digs on its own dry ground, holding back nothing that ever ran to anyone else, falls outside the waters the state was written to guard. Marsh read the date, closed her folder, and let the $8,000 die there in the wind. The name on the complaint was Merle Tollivers. He came to the fence himself in the last week of that dry June, when the county had gone the color of ash, and his own worked-clean fallow had crossed 3 roads as dust. He brought Del Whitcomb from the co-op, the two who had laughed longest, and they looked at what she had grown. Green rows ran the length of the reclaimed ground, wheat heading out heavy and cool, while every field around them lifted and flew. Tolliver took off his hat. Whitcomb said nothing at all. On the road behind them, a line of trucks slowed, farmers leaning to see the one dark field that it held. Hannah opened the notebook to its first page, to the line her grandfather had written across the top, the line she had read aloud to the pond the morning she opened the valve. The water leaves. What it laid down stays. She turned the page toward the wire so the men could read it too. They had told her she drained her only water. What she drained back onto the ground was 20 years of black silt, and the water was never the wealth. The ground was. It carried her farm through the driest year the plains had seen in a lifetime. Land does not owe you a harvest for the taking. It pays back exactly what you feed it, and it keeps the debt for as long as you are willing to wait.